Welcome to this talk hosted by the Institute of Communication Studies in Lille, France. This talk is from Dr. Julian Koch, who presented research from his Marie Skłodowska-Curie postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Copenhagen. Julian's past research focused on the poetry and poetics of the image in the German Jewish poet Paul Celan and the French Jewish poet André du Bouchet, before he turned his attention to documentary film and depictions of genocide. He has published several articles on the question of genocide, which we encourage you to explore further, and his talk today is focused on the issue of perpetrators of genocide and their depiction in documentaries.
Thank you for turning up in such great numbers. Thank you to Oliver for inviting me and to the ISCC for hosting me, and also to the European Union, because they've been funding my research on perpetrators and documentaries on genocide for the last 3 years. It's greatly appreciated. I'll dive straight in. So when I applied for this and when I started my research, I thought, okay, I'll do the classic film studies approach, also like, I don't know, 10 films, something like that, maybe a bit more, closely analyze them for how they represent perpetrators. But in order to do that, I sort of had to find out what films actually have perpetrator representation in them. And so I started watching tons and tons of documentaries. And having grown up in Germany, I knew there was quite a lot of perpetrator representation, at least short bits of perpetrator representation, throughout for decades already, throughout time. And so I had to just find those. And I don't know, over some time, I just realized, wow, there is so much out there. So many different forms of perpetrator representation, so many documentaries, so many genocides that are or aren't really covered. And so I realized, okay, I had to really expand my scope and my lens. And that's where I realized there are lots of extra filmic influences that are really huge as to what documentaries get made about which genocide, how do they represent perpetrators. And so this is then sort of the first bit of my talk, and we'll be kind of walking you through that. And then I'll show you how these play a role in the data, the genocide documentary data that I collected. And it's like an eclectic mix of filmographies established by others, and then kind of quite closely analyzed documentaries that I have selected. And then I'll hone in on 3 case studies, and that could be. All right. Okay, so some key determinants of documentary production, and because obviously to have any perpetrator representation in documentaries, you first need documentaries. And how documentaries get made, about which genocides and why, has all sorts of other contingent, all sorts of extra filmic and contingent factors play a role here. So how destructive was the genocide? If 10% of our population, as opposed to 90% of the population, were killed, then that means, there are likely more films possible just because there are more survivors. And of course, it's always the case that survivors, rather than perpetrators, have a greater incentive to make films about genocide so that it does get remembered as genocide. And if perpetrators make films, we'll see in a bit later tonight, it's very difficult for these films to qualify as documentaries on genocide. Anyway, but it doesn't just matter, how destructive the genocide was and sort of relative or proportionate numbers, but also what segments of the population were targeted. Because if it's sort of middle class, educated middle class, upper middle class, that were disproportionately targeted in any population, then that usually means there are fewer people around later to make films about this subject, because throughout all of the films, all of the genocides, this is sort of the class, the stratum, the demography that makes films, produces films, funds films. Another really important factor is how established was the media film industries before the genocide. And so in the case of Rwanda, for example, the genocide happened in 1994, and there was hardly any filmic infrastructure around. And so that means until the first Rwandan film is made about the genocide, about 10 years have passed. And so you can see these have a huge influence on how a genocide gets represented, because it means certain countries have a voice and others don't, and so on. The main film producing countries on genocide are, for better or worse, are Western countries. At least when it comes to, documentaries and genocide. And so that means, obviously, there are all sorts of biases and factors that influence whether or not some international team gets sent, some Western team gets sent somewhere to cover a genocide, right? And so if the geography experiences a genocide that is geopolitically deemed important for, the predominant producers of genocide documentaries like Western countries, then yes, team gets sent, certain angles are covered. The audiences probably are also more familiar with the subject. You can go into more detail and so on. And then in other cases, geographies that are deemed less important, less interesting for whatever reasons, typically, unfortunately, this is Africa, then you have fewer teams covering it, or the angles in which certain things are covered are, more problematic, just also because the audience is not as familiar and you have to kind of dumb it down and so on. I mean, it's not always the case, but these are definitely tendencies. Huge bonus is whether the genocide was recognized. And really, three factors are important here. Is the genocide recognized at like sort of an international level, the UN ideally, the European Union, some larger kind of body, a supranational body. Also important is where the country, where the countries where the genocide occurred recognize the genocide, because they are generally, they have a strong interest in some form to develop a commemorative tradition, educative tradition on the genocide, and documentaries in many cases, not always, but in many cases are part of this memory formation. So it matters whether a country recognizes the genocide as well. And then tribunals, ideally international legal tribunals, are also enormously important. They're important for perpetrator representation specifically, because it usually means someone has been apprehended and you can point the camera at them all day long if you want, right? So there is footage, and the perpetrators can't really escape so easily. They get asked tough questions. And yeah, it's all there for the cameras. Usually, international tribunals are also really important for all sorts of other reasons. It means because the legal definition of genocide is really restricted. So if a court convicts someone of genocide, an international court, it really means genocide happened, because it has to be so clear. The evidence has to be so overwhelming. And so it's a sort of a stamp, a really kind of high quality stamp of approval, if you will, that that genocide did take place when a court convicts perpetrator of genocide. And historically, these are for historiography. These tribunals are also very important because they got a lot of evidence. This is not a complete list, but another factor that is very important is, when did the genocide take place? This sounds a little weird, maybe. But if you have a genocide that took place in 1904, well, there are very few cameras around. There's not really that much of a film industry. There isn't really anywhere in the world, there's very little film distribution, so there won't be much footage. There won't be many films, and that means almost inevitably there is a delay, or there's very little to begin with to work with. And then another reason is that it took a while for genocide, for the concept of genocide to arise and for genocide to be recognized. And what you see here is then there's more to unpack, but I'll focus predominantly on these lines here. So this is sort of the end of the genocide. Each dot here presents the end of the genocide. And then the line shows how long it took for the first documentary film of any form to be produced. And you can see sort of after 1945, but especially sort of in the 60s, any genocide after the 60s, there's immediately an uptick in documentary production, whereas for these earlier ones, it's a long time. And this has to do with the fact that, the notion of genocide was coined with regard, especially to the Holocaust, and then legally, the entire legal recognition happened after the Holocaust and so on. And then in the 1960s, you have an increasing awareness in general of the Holocaust, Holocaust history writing, really takes up. Then you have the Eichmann trial. Eichmann is apprehended in 1960 and then tried in 1961. And that created a huge boost in the recognition of the Holocaust. And the Holocaust sort of carried other genocides with it. Armenian genocide scholarship starts in the 60s as well. And, the big genocide conference then does include the Armenian genocide as well, which was controversial at the time, which seems bizarre now. Anyway, when you then zoom in on a particular country or countries where the genocide took place, there are all sorts of other factors that then also play a role. So who ruled the country after the genocide? The victim groups or survivor groups, run the country, or did the perpetrators keep running the country? We'll have some cases like that later. Did the country of origin of most perpetrators, or the perpetrators' country, if you will, did they recognize it if it's not the same country where the genocide took place? Were perpetrators prosecuted? To what extent were they prosecuted? How were they prosecuted? And so on. All of these have a huge impact on documentary representations, as you might imagine. And then again, if, for example, there's a really large number of perpetrators, well, in some way, they are there in society. You can't really ignore them. What do you do with them? And if there's a large number of perpetrators, and especially if they have to somehow live in the same space or roughly the same space as victims or descendants of victims, then, you have to sort of engage with them. And usually that also means that you engage with them in some form and through documentaries. Okay, and now I'll show you the data I've collected. And so this is sort of the data I collected myself. It's a couple hundred documentaries. And when it comes to the non-Holocaust documentaries, I've really gone through a lot of effort to find as many as possible. I include shorter documentaries or documentaries that are only distributed on, let's say, YouTube or so, whereas for the Holocaust, I don't, just because there's so much on the Holocaust. And of course, there will be films I've missed for any of these genocides, most likely. But I'm fairly certain for each of them that what I have gathered is pretty representative. And in terms of number and also what is covered. When it comes to the Holocaust, I know, okay, well, there is more than any human can watch, and any human can acquire as well, because a lot of it is in various television archives all over the world. And you have to request that I did with a few that I know had a lot of perpetrator coverage. But it's expensive, it's time consuming, and so on. But there are some fairly comprehensive, or at least fairly elaborate filmographies out there by Yad Vashem, which is a major Holocaust research and memory center museum in Israel. And then the Cinematography, this Holocaust is, it's a German discontinued database. And I've sort of merged them, and I can say roughly there are around 7,000 documentaries in the Holocaust. you can see some things. So the Holocaust already dominates my corpus, and this is without any effort. I just find the stuff more or less, and I'm focused on the stuff that has on the documentaries that have a pretty good spread of what victim groups are covered, what perpetrator groups are covered, and so yeah. But nonetheless, the Holocaust I sort of stumble over almost. And it makes up the majority in terms of the number of films, but it makes even up more when you consider the duration. This is to do with the fact that there are more docu-series on the Holocaust than on any of the other genocides. Now, I collected a lot of data. And one of the interesting ways in which you can kind of disaggregate the data or use very basic quantitative data for interesting insights is, for example, by looking at local versus international production. And it does tell you something of the memory processes that happen across the world and within a particular country. And so, for example, to look at the two extremes, so for the Indonesian genocide, what you have is, we'll get into that a bit more later, the perpetrators reigned for about 30 years after the genocide, and the genocide brought them into power. And so for that time period, there's no coverage of any form really of the genocide proper. But because the perpetrators used film for propaganda means, also to justify their existence and legitimize themselves, there is film education, there's film infrastructure, film distribution. There are audiences, domestic audiences that watch films. And so when this perpetrator regime then kind of falls, and there is a sort of democratization, out of a sudden, not exactly immediately, but slowly and steadily, there are all sorts of filmmakers, survivors, and so on, who go and make films because the infrastructure is there. And now they can. It's democratic enough. It's not without risks, but it's democratic enough, open enough that films can be made and they get audiences. And so this is what happens here. At the same time, so this is why you have such a high percentage of local productions. At the same time, what's interesting to note as well is that various Western countries that typically would, make films about this were relatively complicatedly and complicitly, involved in this. At the very least, they were very happy because it was during the Cold War, and it was a genocide of communist feminists, and this happened in the country with the third largest communist movement. It was the largest outside the Soviet Union and China. And now this communist movement has disappeared, right? And that was great news to the West. And so, but at the same time, there wasn't really, there was some acknowledgement that, this comes at a pretty substantial human cost. So, it was better not to get too much into the details. So there's actually not that much interest in covering what happened then by the countries that typically would make documentaries about this, right? Okay, just on the other end, oh, this is touch screen. You have the Herero-Nama genocide. This is a colonial genocide, not very known. And the perpetrators were Germans. And the Herero-Nama were ethnic groups or are still in ethnic groups in Namibia. But yeah, and they were majority ethnic groups. They are no longer, because of the genocide, they are no longer majority ethnic groups. And so there is very little local production. And I mean, there's also not that much. Film industry is only just kind of growing now. And very unfortunately, most of the non-local productions on the Herero-Nama genocide are then German documentary production. And you can imagine that the German perspective is maybe not the best perspective here. And so, yes, you can see, I mean, you can't just take these numbers mindlessly, but with some additional information, you get quite a lot of interesting, you can make interesting observations. For the Armenian genocide, just as a note, another interesting thing is it seems like, okay, there's very little, Armenians have very little voice in how documentaries present in genocide. But this is actually not true. It's the vast majority, the vast majority of Armenians don't live in Armenia, live also all over the world, and this is because of this genocide. And because Armenia wasn't really a country until the Soviet Union collapsed, and only then could Armenia sort of produce memory narrative focused on Armenia and the Armenian sort of nation. A lot of the Armenian documentary production actually took place outside of Armenia by the Armenian diaspora that's in France, in Canada, and the US predominantly. And so, remarkably, there are very, very few documentaries of the Armenian genocide that don't have quite a substantial input in some form by Armenia. Okay. This is sort of what happens when you graph the sort of temporal distribution of production. And, you know, again, with the Holocaust, don't take this for granted as a representative temporal distribution. And I'll show you some other graph later that includes the much more rich data from Yad Vashem and the Holocaust. Nonetheless, what you do see here is that these will all be documented, or most of them will be documented with some form of representation of perpetrators. And that were in some way at least important. And maybe something to point out here, which I find interesting. It looks a little messy, but unfortunately how it is when you try to plot 8 genocides in one graph. So the orange here is the Bosnian civil war and genocide, and you can see that right when the war broke out in '92, there's an immediate uptake of what's happening. And you can see most of the documentaries, and this includes television reports and so on, but longer television reports, most of this happens right away in the 90s. And what's interesting as well is that from the very beginning, in between 92 and 95, you immediately have Bosnian documentaries, you have Serbian documentaries, Croatian, and so on. So all of the kind of states that are in some way, or nations that are in some way involved in this, have means, filmic means to kind of represent what's happening. It's not, I mean, it's dominantly like the countries outside of this region that make documentaries, but it does have, there is the voice of these various countries as well. Whereas with the Rwandan genocide, which is almost contemporaneous, it happens in '94, you can see there's sort of reasonably quick uptake, but the biggest peaks are actually at the 10-year anniversaries, 2004 and 2014. And as I said, unfortunately, it's only in 2004 when the first Rwandan documentary is made. And so that you can see there are some differences, and these also have to do with geography, fortunately. So with the Rwandan genocide, obviously, is a big field. Okay, just a quick timeline to focus now on the perpetrators rather than the production numbers. As you can imagine, between 45 and 1960, there's all sorts of things that need to be worked through. So you have sort of a relatively quick form of basic documentary footage, or almost raw archival footage, of course, from the liberation of the camps, from some trials of perpetrators. But ultimately, there isn't that much between 45 and 60. There is also not that much perpetrator engagement, certainly not outside of trials. And it takes a while for the genocide notion to gain traction, to get wider recognition. It takes a while even for the Holocaust, not just the Holocaust, not just genocide more generally, to get wider awareness and interest. But one of the events that is definitely very influential is the apprehension of Eichmann, and then the trial, which was extremely mediatized, and we'll see that in a second, actually. And it created a huge, actually less focused on perpetrator, the perpetrator item, but more focused on survivors and witnesses, and create a huge awareness of what happened to the victims during the Holocaust, because there are maybe 70 or 80 or so very elaborate survivor testimonies that are heard during this trial. So this was had a huge impact, and the film was flown across Europe to the United States and so on for it to be shown on television. This is the first time really this happened to a really large audience across the world on television. Also at a time when you have a much greater distribution of television sets and also to households as well. By the way, Israel, not in Israel. Israel still had only this at home. But even before this, there seems to have been sort of the time was ripe in some sense to question perpetrators and how they lived, at least in German society. So there's this completely unknown television report, but relatively controversial at the time, where reporters went around to all these, brew hall and I don't know, pub meetings of SS and asked them about their time. And it's provocatively entitled "The Best Years of My Life." Well, or life, ? But anyway, they talk about, ultimately it's not very revealing in the sense that they don't incriminate themselves. And none of the leaders of any of these associations and meetings let themselves be interviewed. But what is interesting is that this documentary does question, okay, these people still live among us, and to what extent does the spirit of this criminal organization live on also in the remilitarization of Germany, which takes place then. Anyway, so it was a very uncomfortable documentary at the time, in any case, even if it seems relatively tame now. And then in the 70s, you have some of the first. So this is also a German documentary focused on the doctor, the person they focused on, the perpetrator they focused on is dead at the time. But nonetheless, it's relatively unusual in the sense that it starts focusing on not a top-level perpetrator like Hitler and so on, who received coverage from the 60s onwards, more or less nonstop, but focusing on someone who's less prominent. Because in Germany, at least, for a long, long time, so the blame was on Hitler, maybe his entourage, but everyone else was sort of innocent, maybe even a victim. They were all, they had to participate in this war that they didn't want, and it was terrible for Germany, and all the Germans were bombed and so on. And so the fact that there is an increasing focus on sort of mid-level perpetrators and what they did and why they did what they did is in itself already unusual, or starts to become. It's unusual, and it starts to become a greater interest. You also have in the 70s the beginning of docuseries. So the really famous one is The World at War, where Karl Wolf, who's actually really high-ranking, this chief of staff of Himmler. So he's a high-ranking perpetrator, and he's interviewed, but he actually doesn't talk about himself. And this, unfortunately, is not too uncommon in docuseries that find perpetrators are interviewed that just sort of deflect any uncomfortable questions about their responsibility by talking about someone else. These trends continue in the 80s and become even more prominent, with longer testimonies being shown in documentaries. They're given more space and time. And then from the 90s on, you have some newer trends. So you've got animation documentaries, but they're mostly focused on the Holocaust. There's very little perpetrator representation, and the little there isn't particularly interesting in helping to understand perpetrators in any form. But what is perhaps more interesting for perpetrator representation is the use of reenactments. And there are sort of two forms. The most dominant is certainly the use of actors who play or reenact certain historical scenes that we don't have visual documentation of. And they do this sort of to, perhaps you could say, to dramatize, to make it more interesting. But at the same time, in the case of the Holocaust, which was very much sort of orally transmitted, the orders were orally transmitted. There's obviously written documentation, but it's quite surprising how little there is. In a famous book, for example, on Hitler's involvement in the Holocaust is The Unwritten Order by Peter Longerich, who is one of the experts. And so I think reenactments lend themselves in some nice way, particularly nice way, to, in some form, helping to reconstruct, not simply to dramatize, but also to help reconstruct the dynamics of genocide and what happened in ways that the existing archival footage simply can't do. Right? Anyway, another use of reenactments is when perpetrators reenact what they did. And there are various ways and various forms of this, but two interesting films, one I'll discuss later a bit more, but two interesting films are Reti Pan's S21, and there's a really young perpetrator, he was maybe 12 or 13 at the time, who doesn't really talk much. But then he's sort of asked to go through a typical day in this torture prison and extermination camp sort of in Cambodia, and to kind of just show his daily routine. And you can sort of see this is really the only time when he gets any space and you can see him really for any longer duration in this documentary, because then he is sort of showing the violence of his actions, even though it's just him, the rooms are empty, there are no props, nothing. But yeah, it kind of very vividly shows the violence of what he did. In some ways, not despite, but because there are no props. There's nothing there. It seems almost absurd, right? Yeah, and we'll get into the act of killing in one of the case studies. Oh yeah, and then I guess something to mention. Colorization of footage is then a new thing from 2010 so onward, with the great onset of and revolution of AI. But this again is very focused on the Holocaust, very focused on Hitler, and all of the big wigs that you have archival footage of, which you won't really of any lower ranking perpetrator. Okay. Typical patterns, unfortunately, are that there's a really heavy focus on one particular perpetrator or perpetrator group, and the same goes for the victims. One particular victim group that's focused on, and when it comes to kind of causal factors, ideology is heavily emphasized, and that there were long-standing plans for committing this genocide. Contingent factors that in all genocides play a very important role are typically not focused on, because it's this combination that provides this narrative dramatic arc of genocide accelerated and then it stopped in some form. But this is not really how genocide necessarily plays out. So what's missing typically is the converse, the multiplicity of different perpetrator groups. And there's, in every genocide, there's a surprising number of very different perpetrator groups with actually quite different motivations for why they did what they did. And you have very rarely representation of several hierarchical levels within one document. Usually they have focus on one particular, either low-ranking perpetrator or even more often on a high-ranking perpetrator. And you rarely have, to really understand genocide and perpetrators, actually, it would be better to have the different hierarchical levels to show you the multiplicity of, why participate. The same goes for victim groups. And of course, because you have this monofocal obsession with particular perpetrators and particular victims, you don't get the full, or at least a fuller sense of the motivations that play a role. And finally, one thing that I find quite surprising is that there's very little attention to, and that's probably the biggest thing that's missing. There's very little attention to geographical variations in the intensity of genocide, and there's also very little attention to the variation of, the intensity of persecution over time. Oops. Okay. And maybe the best example for this is the Holocaust. We all know 6 million Jews died, and they are definitely the primary target of the Nazis. They're persecuted more or less from day one. And in terms of absolute and relative numbers, they're the single most persecuted group, and most lethally and so on. But the majority of victims of Nazi violence are actually not non-Jewish, non-combatants. They're just not a single identity. And so that makes it a bit harder to grasp, I assume. The second largest victim group, for example, and this is a particularly interesting one, because they share so much with how they were persecuted, with Jews as well. And the second largest victim groups are Soviet prisoners of war. And 3 million of them are starved and shot, predominantly by the Wehrmacht, by the German army, and predominantly at the beginning of the war. So that within about 8 to 10 months of the war, 2 million were already dead. And they are starved based on plans ultimately to starve all of, more or less, the occupied Eastern Europe. And they are starved just because they were already apprehended in confined spaces, just like Jews were starved already at this point in the ghettos, as part of more or less the same plan. But there is no documentary dedicated to them, and there's also no English monograph dedicated to them. And the only, really, if you want to research this, you have to know German. It's the only substantial and good research almost entirely is only German. And so, yeah, I've tried to make like a little bit of a list of the different numbers and the time patterns. And the thing is, there's a lot of overlap between these different groups and why they were persecuted and for what reasons and so on. And really, you get a much better understanding of the whole cost of the Jews proper if you take this wider lens. So if that's the only thing you're interested in, really, you still have to cover these other groups. Even when it comes to just, the genocide of the Jews, you have some odd patterns that might not be surprising to you. But here you can see this. So this is based on the data from the plot descriptions and so on from the Yad Vashem and the Cinematography of the Holocaust filmographies. And this is how often these different camps occur in these plot descriptions in the data. And as you can see, so with the exception of the early years, and this is to do with the fact that the first, the Americans and the British liberated camps that weren't extermination camps, so concentration camps in Germany. And so you get a lot of the early footage that the Brits and the Americans focus on is focused on the camps that aren't in the East. And that means they're not extermination camps. So all the extermination camps are in the East and in Poland. But quite quickly after that, Auschwitz dominates. Now you might think, well, it was the biggest. And true, it's true. But Auschwitz, for example, was responsible for 1 million to 1.1 million deaths. Treblinka was responsible for 900,000 to 1 million deaths. And all of the other extermination camps combined together with Treblinka are responsible for far more deaths in Auschwitz. Nonetheless, they received very little coverage. Why? Well, it's to do with the fact that, the biggest kind of receives disproportionately more attention for most things. But it's also to do with the fact that there are different kinds of Jews killed in these camps. So Auschwitz was the camp where almost exclusively all the Western Jews and some Eastern Jews were killed. But the Western Jews were killed a bit later. They were well connected typically, and they were missed. And also, they are more similar to, the average audience in France, in the US, in Britain, than the Eastern European Jews. And so, that makes them more sympathetic. There's a whole debate of, fiction film representations of Jews, the Jews that look very, typically Western, assimilated, and so on, precisely for these reasons. The audience can more empathize with them. Anyway, and then similar patterns are observable when it comes to perpetrators. And here you can see the Eichmann peak, huge. But in general, naturally, Hitler dominates, right? Now, this has to be taken with a grain of salt. So this is simply the occurrence of, for example, the Wehrmacht of any of these groups in the data. And I can show you, if you're interested, I can show you the methodologies on it later. But anyway, it's too nitty-gritty. But so the Wehrmacht actually isn't necessarily covered as a perpetrator group here. In most of these documentaries, it will simply be covered as a party to the war in all these military documentaries, for example. And so then it's not really about the Wehrmacht crimes and involvement in crimes. It's about Wehrmacht fighting battles and so on. But nonetheless, some interesting patterns, apart from Eichmann and Hitler dominating, are seen here. So we've got from the 90s onwards an increasing focus on the earlier part of the Holocaust, which is outside the camps, and the mass shooting of Jews by various groups, predominantly involving the SS, the police, the so-called Einsatzgruppen, and a few other units, sometimes also the Wehrmacht. And this begins to be researched sort of in the 90s and later. And then, and this is actually something that happens quite often, especially when it comes to the Holocaust, there's a little bit of a lag, but then eventually it gets taken up in documentaries. And so you can see here in 2004, unfortunately slightly covered by the text here, but there is a clear peak of, when you have quite a lot of coverage of the early part of the Holocaust and the perpetrator groups involved in it. So Einsatzgruppen and police and so on. Yeah, if you want to explore graphs like this, you can go to the website. And I've just finished training all the models, so there will be possibilities for semantic search as well. The main issue will be how accommodating the website can be, because I'm using like a free cloud thing, and computing power and memory are sort of limited. Anyway, okay, now moving to the second case study. Just to give you a little bit of a background, so this is the anti-communist, anti-feminist genocide in 65, 66. And the way it unfolds is a little bit confusing. So what happens first is a left-wing or left-leaning part of the military stages some form of coup, and it's still a little bit unclear what exactly the goal was, and this coup fails. During this coup, they kill a few generals, relatively high-ranking generals. But a right-wing part of the army is sort of ready for it. They know something is cooking, and then swoops into action and suppresses this coup, this left-wing coup. So there's this right-wing counter coup. And this right-wing counter coup immediately starts blaming the communists and feminists organizations, unions, and so on. And the reasons for it are relatively obvious. Why? Because these are political opponents. These are people that would be in the way of the army taking power. The communist movement in Indonesia, unlike in the Soviet Union or in China, was very much a democratic one and wanted to, if anything, gain power through simple votes. And it was very much on the way there. Anyway, but they are now in the way of military rule, and so they get killed in large numbers. And so a really almost unlikely alliance of various groups, religious groups, political groups, together with the military, start killing communists. And so this is a successful dictatorship in the sense that it rules for several decades, commits further genocides or mass violence, acts of mass violence. It's a really violent regime. And one of the ways in which it's successful as well is how it legitimizes itself, because it came to power with a genocide, through a genocide. But what do you do? You know, these people have disappeared. How do you cover the events of 65? And so the solution was to paint the communists as the perpetrators. And so they create several films, but one of them is particularly prominent, in which focuses on how, you know, this left-wing part of the military apprehends these generals and kills them, and adds all sorts of fictional flourish, if you will. So there are these feminists who dance around these generals and cut off their genitals and sort of quasi-rape them, and then they're killed in gruesome ways, very violent. And this is the entirety of how the events of 65 are represented. So it's the kind of the commemoration of the death of a few generals instead of the death of hundreds of thousands, possibly 500,000 or more people. And this then occupies sort of the memory space. And the victims are the perpetrators. And the perpetrators, of course, are the heroes, because they saved the country from these brutal, evil people. Of course, you know, what is missing is, what did the historical actual perpetrators do? Can't really go into too much detail, of course, because once you do, you have to kind of cover the mass violence that happened, right? So they're acknowledged as heroes in some form, if they're acknowledged at all, but there's never really any going into detail. And so this changes when this American Joshua Oppenheimer and his team, and it's a Danish team, and they have been in the country for some time, in part to cover unions and in Indonesia, and, you know, Western exploitation Western companies exploiting Indonesian workers and preventing the unionization and so on. And of course, because unions were targeted, it's, you know, a broad issue, and people are afraid to form unions because of what happened. There is some awareness, of course, in the sort of memory subspace, what had happened. And some of these companies actually even employ some of these perpetrators from the past as overseers of the workers, as a form of preventing unionization, for example. Anyway, so this team comes, what's interesting is that because Joshua Oppenheimer is American, these perpetrators talk to him quite openly, because the Americans provided membership lists of the Communist Party that were better and more comprehensive than the Indonesian militaries, and that then helped, you know, the killing of communists. And so they are aware of that. They are low-ranking perpetrators, but they're fully aware of the American support. And they're like, oh yeah, we did all these things, and, you know, you must think it's great, and so on. And he's like, oh yeah, maybe I should make some film with you. And then in reminiscence of this propaganda film, they start making a film. But what's different, of course, is that now they are the ones being brutal. And sort of almost inadvertently, they show or reveal themselves to be the actually brutal and violent ones. And so the inversion of the inversion of the relationship between perpetrator and victims is now happening in this film. And I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which this is obviously very provocative, and some people at least think it's highly controversial and problematic. And there are some ways in which, you know, sure, it's problematic in the sense that, once again, it's some foreigner rescuing Indonesia from its lack of engagement with its history. But one thing I think that is really important to stress is because it is so provocative, it has received a lot more attention than any other film on this. And it also has received a lot more attention in Indonesia than any other film. And Oppenheimer has made sure that this film is viewable in Indonesia. It's on YouTube, which isn't blocked, actually. And so the Indonesian version, English subtitle versions get taken down after a while, but the Indonesian version has been on there on YouTube from day one. And if you look through the comments, there are hundreds of comments. And they're almost all entirely in Bahasa Indonesia. And the film has 3 million views, which is the only film with even remotely similar numbers, viewership numbers, compared to the lots and lots of versions of the government propaganda film, which you also find on YouTube, and which unfortunately still have far more millions of views. But nonetheless, this is, I think it's a very important film, just for this very dynamic, revealing this dynamic. Okay, last case. So the Cambodian genocide, together also with the Bosnian genocide, they tend to have quite a good corpus of documentaries on this. And in the Cambodian genocide, what's interesting is that the documentaries, among other things, reveal some particularly interesting and unique dynamics about perpetration during the Cambodian genocide. One of which is the persecution of party members, of perpetrators themselves. So you have this kind of really uncomfortable dynamic in which perpetrators can, in some ways, also become victims of their own apparatus of perpetration. And this is to do with the fact that the communist movement started as sort of a relatively loose affiliation of resistance groups and forces. And when civil war breaks out, these grow in strength over time. The prince Sihanouk, the king at the time, gets ousted by a right-wing military regime, again supported by the Americans, of course, because the Vietnam War is nearby, so they sort of want to stabilize the region. Anyway, but this Prince Sihanouk then throws his weight behind the communist movement. And so you've got all these alliances that are sort of uneasy, uniting against this military dictatorship, and this communist movement itself. Even within the communists, among the communists, you've got various moderates and more extreme versions of, beliefs of what communism should be like once the country is won. And so eventually, when they do conquer the country, the capital falls in 1975, there are these extreme efforts by the Central Committee to gain control over all these different regions, over all these different sub-movements in the communist movement. And to a really large extent, there's also an extreme amount of paranoia in the Central Party as to who is plotting against them and who's opposing them. So much so that a large number, surprisingly large number of members of the Central Committee even get killed. Down to, when Pol Pot was already, the communists had sort of lost already a long time ago. There's just a small survivor group in the jungle, Pol Pot and his entourage and a few fighters. And this is, in the late 90s. So the Cambodia, the official reign of the communists ends in 79, right? But there's a sort of constant guerrilla war by the communists until the 90s. Anyway, so we're in the jungle in the 90s, and Pol Pot decides, I'm being betrayed by my former chief head of security, and he and his entire family needs to be killed. And so this is, in I think 97 or so, and then in 98 he dies, and he's turned over by he's sort of betrayed eventually. His best friend, his right-hand man, is like, this is too much. You've killed your left-hand man, basically. You have to be handed over to the authorities, but it's more or less too late. He gives one final brief interview. I have no remorse. Everything I did was right, and dies. Anyway, but what's interesting in these documentaries is you can see, because there's a lot of engagement with perpetrators, and it's an uneasy engagement with perpetrators, because a lot of these perpetrators are like, oh, you're also victims. And to some extent, that may be true, but this obviously, that doesn't, at the same time, simply exculpate them. In any case, what is interesting is that there are, you can see some of these dynamics of constant persecution, even of the perpetrators. And so this is Nguyen Chia, who is the second highest member of the Central Party, and he talks about how the party cadres, the communists, the members of the party, betrayed us. They are agents for foreigners, and they had this idea that somehow the Viet Cong, the communists, the Soviet Union's intelligence service, and the American intelligence service were all plotting together against them. I mean, that shows you the extent to which there was this kind of paranoia and fear of losing control. And here you have one of the perpetrators who's a guard in S-21 in this butcher American camp, who is saying, yeah, if you didn't obey, you were dead for sure. And I mean, I can't really judge to what extent this is true to him, for him in particular, because, of course, there's an incentive for every perpetrator to say that, to exculpate themselves. But nonetheless, it's one of the patterns that is very evident, that compared even to at least the general population, disproportionate number of party members even were killed. And these are some of the locations of the purges. And this is the largest purge in the Eastern Zone, because it borders Vietnam, and Vietnam is an arch enemy of, at least turns out to become an arch enemy during the reign of the communists in Cambodia. And unfortunately, the one thing that's here missing is the degree of exactly the ethnic element of persecution during the Cambodian genocide, with the Vietnamese being the single most targeted group. Cambodian Vietnamese and Vietnamese in the most targeted group. There's a single survivor that I have ever heard of. But yeah, anyway, in general, you can see, I think very nicely in these documentaries, the complicated patterns in which genocide can unfold. And yeah, it's a maybe a unique case, or it stands apart from the others, at least. But yeah, it shows you how complicated perpetrators can be. And this is ultimately the takeaway. Perpetrators are a diverse group of people, and genocides are complex. They have many causes. And so I think it's very important to pay attention, unfortunately, to the complicated patterns. And I mean, I do realize, and this is always the big trade-off and the careful balance that documentarists need to strike between having a broader appeal to a larger audience, because ultimately most documentaries do have this goal to sort of educate a broader audience to understand and to bring across what happened and why it happened, while at the same time, they can't be too reductive either. And to some extent, these are at odds. Some of the problems, however, and this is where I sort of leave the field of documentary and film, have to do with how we commemorate things in general, and even how we write, even quite academic histories of genocide. And the problem with genocide, unfortunately, is that it provokes these very simple binaries, good versus evil. And you're either purely a perpetrator, purely evil, or you're totally innocent. And, beyond, you have sort of this indisputable moral standing if you've been victimized. And that's not necessarily always true. And there are all sorts of ways in which we don't pay attention to a lot of cases of mass violence, of conflict, even to really lethal indirect consequences of conflict that might be far worse in terms of mortality than the conflict itself, the people that get killed by guns and artillery. And we do need to pay much more attention to these. So yeah, there's an article I wrote on this as well, if you're interested. When it comes to then analyzing documentary, any particular one, I think it's always good to bear in mind these questions. What's the source of the image? What is shown? Who shot it? And why might they have shot it? Filmmakers' circumstances, and even the production team's circumstances as well, not just the director or whatever. All of these have certain interest necessarily. That doesn't mean it's bad or good, but it's always good to question what this interest is and ask yourself, why are they there? What are they covering? And then what isn't covered? What's possibly missing? What do you not have images of? Because unfortunately, or almost inevitably, documentaries show or try to show what their stuff of which there is already footage, right? But what the events that you have footage of might not necessarily be the most representative events. When we talk about the Bosnian genocide, for example, the genocide proper, the Srebrenica genocide, didn't happen in camps, but almost all of the footage is focused on the camps. It doesn't mean that the camps were good, but the mass killing happened outside of the view of the cameras. And so the iconic element here is the camps, because they remind us of the Holocaust. And this has some problems, of course. And yeah, socio-political and historical circumstances have an enormous influence at all times. What gets taken up, what doesn't get taken up. So it's important to keep this in mind. And then I have some final film recommendations. There are lots more I could recommend. This is just a sample, if you will. Thank you.